In 58 BC, Julius Caesar's career as consul was over, and so, as was custom, he would be assigned provinces to govern over. These were Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, and from those provinces Caesar prepared his army for a spectacular campaign, a glorious era of conquest and success in the region known today as the Balkans. The Dacian tribes were growing in numbers and forming a mighty empire of their own. Such an unknown people to the Romans would give any victorious commander even greater prestige than any familiar enemy ever could. Not only that, but there was high potential for great riches too, riches that Caesar needed to cover his massive debts, likely mostly owed to Crassus at the time. Caesar was getting old, 41, old as generals historically go, but not too old for Roman standards. An ambitious man, heavily in debt, with a lot to prove, is what made Caesar so hungry for a successful campaign. Although not 100% certain, it is believed Caesar was planning such a conquest to be in the Balkans, but then all things changed when the governor of Transalpine Gaul died. The territory, logically, was handed over to Caesar, suddenly opening up more potential. The Gauls, although not as unknown as the Dacians, would be just as prestigious to conquer, if not more so. Gaul had forever haunted the Romans, the savage barbarians to the north, and in later years the creeping unknown that lay just on the other side of those daunting mountains, the Alps. Gaul terrified Rome, and rightfully so. It was the Gauls who sacked Rome in 390 BC, over 300 years before Caesar's time, but still prevalent in the hearts and minds of Romans. And was it not from Gaul, across those dreadful mountains, that Hannibal invaded, a name so fearsome that we even associate death to it to this day? The conquest of Gaul, the final end of Rome's great fears, would grant any conqueror great prestige. Two tribes in Gaul, the Aedui and the Sequani, were allies of Rome, but at war with each other. In 71 BC, the Sequani summoned aid from the Germanic king Ariovistus, who inflicted a heavy defeat onto the Aedui. This was followed by an attack from the Helvetii. The Aedui requested help from Rome. Rome sent envoys, but nothing came from this. When Caesar was consul, he reached out an offer of friendship towards the Germanic king, Ariovistus, instead. Gaul was full of these tribes, who often fought, making the region very tumultuous, with the balance of power constantly shifting. By the time Caesar was governor, a massive horde of the Helvetii were on their way, around 92,000 soldiers and 276,000 civilians amassed on the borders of Rome. They were seeking a new, more fertile homeland, far away from the mountains. They did not wish to settle in Rome, but in western Gaul. The Helvetii so insistent on this migration that they burnt all their belongings back home. There would be no turning back. Ogatorix was their main chieftain, elected to power by the other chieftains of the tribe. According to Caesar though, Ogatorix wished to be king, and was going to use the migration to cement his power. Ogatorix went as a diplomat to the Aedui and Sequani and met with their two leaders, requesting free, safe passage. Ogatorix told them to hope for kingship someday, perhaps suggesting that in return of safe passage, the Helvetii will help those leaders cement themselves as kings of their own tribes, rather than hold the limited position of elected chieftain. But word got out, and back to the Helvetii nobles. Ogatorix was to stand trial for tyranny, which would mean death if found guilty. Ogatorix attended the trial with an army of 10,000 loyal supporters, or men who owed a debt to him. They were outnumbered 8-1, but none of this mattered. as Artaxerxes was found dead anyway, not long after, suicide being the believed cause. All according to Caesar anyway. Some scholars disagree, but I won't get into all of that today. The Helvetii still went through their migration and began massing on the border. Caesar arrived on the scene and then saw the sheer scale of the people who would be crossing. This panicked him. He only had one legion nearby. His other three were camped near Aquileia. Some historians believe that Caesar intended to carry out his Balkan campaign still at this stage. Caesar began preparing his legion and recruiting local levies. The bridge that would allow them entry into Roman soil was destroyed. The Helvetii met with Caesar, requesting permission to cross into Transalpine Gaul, promising they would not plunder on their way, but Caesar was gravely outnumbered and did not trust them. If the Helvetii were to lie, then that would surely mean the end of Transalpine Gaul and Caesar's career with it. He played for time and requested 2 or 3 weeks to think about it. This time was used to continue recruiting and preparing defensive fortifications. For 19 Roman miles stood a 16-foot-high rampart of earth. Caesar, upon completion of this engineering marvel, let his decision be known to the Helvetii. They were not to cross. For the Helvetii, though, going back simply was not an option. The chieftains ordered the people to stay and wait, but many thought they had stayed long enough and wished to get back on the move. So they did. Conflict ensued, but the Helvetii quickly realised a push into Caesar's defences would be futile. Their plan was to go around and head through the Sequani territory instead, who they had managed to convince to allow safe passage. Once past, they entered the land of the Aedui, whose representatives complained to Caesar that they were plundering their land and kidnapping their children. Other smaller tribes also complained about the Helvetii, all either allies of Rome or allies of Rome. This was the justification Caesar had been looking for, and so war was underway. In defence of the Helvetii, though, it is likely food and supplies for them would have been low due to all the delays. Also, a massive horde is very difficult to control. Caesar raised 2 more legions and waited for his other legions to arrive, in total amassing 6 legions, with 1 still on the ramparts. These legions would be difficult to feed, so it was negotiated with the Aedui, who would help provide the grain to the Romans during the war. Caesar's army caught up, but most of the Helvetii had already crossed the river. Still stuck on Caesar's side were a small subgroup of the Helvetii, the unsuspecting Tigerini. This tribe had dealt a devastating defeat onto Rome before, killing even the grandfather of Caesar's father-in-law. The Romans were able to come at the tribe with surprise and butchered them before crossing the river themselves. The Helvetii came to Rome seeking peace, but warning they were willing to fight if this would be rejected. Caesar countered this with a demand that they must give hostages to Rome as a sign of goodwill, and must make amends to the tribes that they had raided on the way. The Helvetii refused, stating that they only take hostages, never gave. The Helvetii kept marching, and Caesar kept following. Skirmishes broke out along the journey, skirmishes that were to the advantage of the Helvetii, but Caesar's main problem was the supplies. He was running short, and the grain promised by the Aedui had not yet arrived, despite constant promises that it someday would. Caesar confronted his ally over this, who was also present on the battlefield, with an army led by a Dumnorix. Basically, it turned out Dumnorix was responsible for these delays, and did not like the idea of relying on Romans to win their tribe's battles. Not only this, but the man was apparently wishing to be granted a kingship over his tribe, which would be a betrayal to his own tribe's system. Dumnorix was a powerful man though, and punishment would look bad on Roman-Aedui relations. Caesar summoned the chieftain to him, stated that he knew of the man's betrayal, but offered a second chance. The Noricks accepted, knowing he could not defeat Caesar and the Romans in battle. The grain was on its way. This is interesting, as it is one of the first major instances we see of Caesar using mercy and forgiveness as a diplomatic tool to gather loyal supporters in debt to him. The push continued, but again Caesar worried about his supplies and so pulled back, wishing to restock first. Some Gallic traitors deserted and reported to the Helvetii that the Romans were retreating. The Helvetii turned around and pursued. Battle was joined and Caesar won. The remnants of the Helvetii eventually surrendered, so ending the first push of Caesar into Gaul. The Helvetii were forced to return to their homeland and to rebuild there. They would become a vassal of Rome, ultimately acting as a buffer in the Alps to protect Rome from possible Germanic invasions. But for now, for Caesar, there was a temporary period of peace in Gaul. What would be the call that would allow Caesar justification to continue the conflict? I may discuss in a future video, depending if people are interested or not. Anyway, hope you enjoyed and learnt something. Leave a like if you did, and subscribe to get notified of the next one. And please share this video with anyone you think may be interested. It really helps me out. But for now, this has been the history of diplomacy.